Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Could you place San Marino on a map? Probably not. Yet this microstate surrounded by Italy has become instrumental in wielding Russian influence operations across the continent, so much so that its foreign service seems to have been co-opted by it. It's just one in the examples of that shows how far Moscow goes in its war effort against Ukraine. Jacob Judah is a freelance journalist who's been covering these developments across numerous continents, and he joins us now. Hello and welcome, Jacob.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Jacob, this is an odd one. Well, first of all, let's ask that question: where is San Marino on the map?
So San Marino is, as you said, a kind of microstate entirely surrounded by Italy. It's the closest to to Bologna, which is the closest big city. Otherwise, its airport and kind of really the way people get in and out is through Rimini, which is on the Adriatic coast of Italy.
So it's just on that sort of the eastern side,
Exactly.
a bit below.
Yes.
And then I think the really interesting thing is how did you cross this story? And in a second it involves a particular diplomat. But how did you come across him, and how did it evolve?
Well, I think the way I came across this is really kind of a classic case of kind of journalistic sleuthing and kind of seeing something odd and then going, that doesn't sit well with me. I saw a very small report saying that this gentleman, who I'm sure we will talk about, had been appointed San Marino's ambassador to Algeria, which immediately raises a red flag to me as to, first of all, why does San Marino need an ambassador to Algeria, and would this gentleman do all day? So I kind of looked into it, and what I realised is that San Marino's foreign ministry.
I mean, were you studying the diplomatic list of San Marino? How did that pop up?
Well, what I kind of noticed in many ways by accident is that San Marino's foreign ministry as all foreign ministries around the world has a portal for its own diplomatic personnel and consuls, and to share kind of administrative letters mainly, things that are not very much of interest, and they had basically not figured out that you could get into it via the back door. What I mean by that is that if you knew what you were looking for, in this case, this gentleman and his name and when he was appointed and details about him, you could get in by simply going on a search engine and putting in exactly what you wanted, and the document would pop up. And then you would be able to see kind of all the myriad of very unusual figures, I think, that San Marino has been giving consular appointments, and well as kind of ambassador at large status and various things that I think would raise
Jacob, here's the
eyebrows.
question. I don't understand how you got the idea to go to San Marino to start with. You must have had some kind of inkling from somewhere.
The inkling came from spotting this guy being appointed as ambassador to Algeria, which I think is just it's so odd that there must have been something unusual going on to have a San Marino's ambassador in Algeria. Also, not least because he didn't appear on Algeria's diplomatic list, and didn't also appear as kind of officially having been given this title by San Marino, even though the reporting was there, and the San Marino's later confirmed it to me that they had appointed him. But perhaps there's a chance actually to go and talk about this gentleman, because I think he's the real.
Yeah, no, so tell us about him. Who is he? What's his background?
So this diplomat, as I think he would prefer to be called, is Emmanuel Gou. So he's a kind of French-Italian businessman, but someone who has had a long past with Russia. He really jumps off the page to you as someone who is a kind of blast from another era, an era of kind of business openness with Russia, where there are lots of these sort of middle-aged kind of French and Italian executives kind of going and moving to Moscow and trying to make some money there. But basically, he worked in the 90s with former Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi, setting up TV channels and kind of expanding the media empire to the collapsing Soviet bloc. And then in the early 2000s, he basically moved to Moscow and set up a kind of strategic consultancy, as many did at the time. But he started advising various agencies of the Russian government, including sort of things like kind of Rosneft and Gazprom and Rosatom, and especially for him, Rosatom. And he was going around the world, kind of speaking Rosatom's name, trying to get people to build Russian nuclear power plants, basically. And then after a while, he kind of moves back to his attention moves back to Europe, and he helped set up the French branch of Russia Today, which the Russian propaganda channel in Paris, and allegedly, according to various French media reports, which I believe are accurate, he spotted the French far right, future French far right presidential candidate Éric Zemmour, and introduced him to important figures in the Kremlin. And according to various other bits and pieces that I have been told and others have reported, he's also played other roles and sort of linking up these sort of types of figures like that.
He is a very influential sort of fix-it man for the Kremlin.
Yes, I mean it seems so, especially in Rome, where he seems to have a kind of quite extensive political contact book, shall we say?
And so then, I don't get this. And where does I mean, obviously, well, first of all, why Algeria, and then how did San Marino get this?
I'll take the second part of that question first, because I think then the Algeria emerges afterwards. It's kind of the million-dollar question. It's kind of, why is San Marino giving this gentleman a full diplomatic appointment? And that's what's unusual about this story, because, look, with other small countries, every so often one of them does something strange and they give a passport to someone, or they appoint someone as a consul. But here, what is unusual is that San Marino has given this gentleman a full diplomatic appointment. So he's an ambassador like any other, benefits from various privileges and immunities, as any other ambassadors do. And it's a puzzle, really, why this guy was given an appointment in February 22, a few days before the invasion of Ukraine. The San Marinese can't really answer the question of why they gave him a diplomatic appointment, and have been kind of rather curt in answering questions and things that would suggest that perhaps there were reasons there that they didn't want to reveal, so to speak. But anyway, in February 22, he was given an ambassador at large status by the Republic of San Marino. And then a year later, I think in a way to kind of formalize his role, he was appointed as ambassador to Algeria. There was I heard some musings from people in Rome about whether he was trying to have an involvement between characters in Algiers, but I think that's speculation. I mean, I think the point is that giving him an Algerian ambassadorial appointment is sort of formalizing him in the system. So he would appear, for example, on their list of diplomats. I think he would be there first in Africa. But even though he would be based in Italy or wherever his village that he lives in, I think somewhere in northern Italy.
I think that what we're going to pick up on, we're going to jump around quite a bit, is that the reporting that you've done since the invasion of Ukraine has led you've done stories on tech, going many islands in the Pacific, cooperation or lack of it in the Arctic, Russia, Transnistria, and Moldova. So a whole range of subjects over very years, and the common thread to all of these is basically it's in some way or other a response to what's going on in Ukraine, and we're going to jump around. Staying with the San Marino story before we move on to area. Do you have any more? I think of Wagner and obviously the importance of Algerian oil. Why Algeria? Why would you want some of the diplomatic immunity in Algiers?
I mean, what I meant, I think, is by formalizing him from the San Marinese perspective. I mean, in some sense, I think, he's not really ambassador to Algeria, if that makes sense. I mean, he's given this post to give him a certain amount of, and this is my view on it. I mean, of course, he didn't answer my right of reply, so he perhaps have a different perspective. But to kind of ensure that he has a certain amount of legitimacy and authenticity. I mean, when it comes to San Marino, I think the most interesting thing that was said to me during this piece is actually something that's almost slightly distinct from their weird kind of dodgy diplomats, and there are more than just Mr. Gu, which is that San Marino has played, according to kind of senior Italian intelligence officials, this kind of unusual role, and has been used by Russia and to a lesser extent by China as a sort of rear base for espionage operations, especially against Italy, obviously. And one of the things that surprised me, and I think this surprised everyone that I've spoken to, is that actually San Marino is somewhere that's out of sight. I mean, it's tiny, it's small, but ultimately, kind of, if you maintain an espionage network in Rome or in kind of a nearby country, you can meet agents and you can do dodgy financial deals in San Marino simply for the fact that, I mean, one of the reasons that they don't have their own intelligence agency, so they're not really up on it, but also that because it's an independent state, it's difficult for the Italians to just barge down the door, perhaps like the French would have done in Monaco. This was happening, to just barge down the door and go, no, you can't do any of this. We're putting a stop to this immediately. It's diplomatically delicate, shall we say? So it presents this sort of interesting.
It's the protection that it offers rather than
exactly.
Yeah. So he's not going off to Algeria. It's just recognizing that San Marino is a very useful place. And what has, you said they've been quite terse about him, but have there been other developments because of the story?
Yes, I can give you the response in two ways. I mean, one is that from the San Marino's officials, they've kind of, I think, were not very welcoming with the story, so to speak. I mean, when their foreign minister Luca Beccari was in Brussels last week for the completion stages of an association agreement that San Marino is negotiating with the EU, he described it as an unjustified concern and a pity that this piece had come out. I would stress that no San Marino's official has said that anything in the piece was incorrect, which of course you would expect them to do if they were really kind of denying most of the allegations. The other interesting thing which I think has come out is some of the political responses in San Marino. I mean, there's been a call now for San Marino to set up its own intelligence agency to make sure that it knows what's going on in its territory. There's also been a general dissatisfaction that San Marino is so small that one piece that comes out internationally can really kind of affect its reputation. Ultimately, my response to that is probably you shouldn't be doing kind of dodgy deals, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah. Okay, Jacob, just tell us a bit about more yourself, and also, so who do you write for, and why? What's led you down this route? Why are you covering these stories?
So I'm as you said at the start, I'm a freelance journalist. I've written kind of I think by this stage for most people, The Economist. I've written for the FT. I've written for the New York Times. I've written for the Telegraph and many others. In some sense, I think this is the kind of really kind of a journalistic answer, which is I've been writing about these people because there are no correspondents who write about these places, and that there are interesting stories that are not covered. And as a freelancer, this is perhaps to make money, you need to chase the places where there are no correspondents, basically. And I think so far with these stories, I think I have been vindicated. I mean, even talking to intelligence figures in some European countries, I think there was a general surprise. San Marino? What? I've never thought about San Marino. It's never come across my desk. People that you would expect it to have come across their desk said that. So I think if intelligence figures are not thinking about San Marino, then journalists are definitely not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, let's jump on to another area, and the overlap is that many you covering we go to too. And that's the place I'm really thinking of is Moldova and Transnistria. We're actually going to Transnistria in just under 4 weeks' time. This is absolutely fascinating here. This is a country right on the border with Ukraine, and I think I'll leave you to sum up to it. Why is Moldova affected in a way that perhaps no other country in the region is by the conflict next door?
I mean, the simple answer, there are many ways which that question could be answered. I mean, one is Moldova is small. It's not a member of the EU. It's not a member of NATO. That's the basic one. The second is that there's obviously this unresolved political dispute with Transnistria, where there's a small Russian military presence. Russia has long staged influence operations in Chisinau, aiming to kind of destabilize the incumbent government, which is pro-European, and ensure that Moldova, as it hoped to do in Ukraine, sort of looks to Moscow in its geopolitical orientation. Moldova is also, and I think this is something which I think is often missed in the international coverage of Moldova, is economically very, very fragile. And that the economic winds of the war in Ukraine have really affected it in a very bad way, and that has opened it up, I think, to further destabilization efforts by Russia.
I think it's important to state the geography as well. You've got the Transnistria, which is a small slither of territory across the Dniester, and the am I right in naming that? Maybe I got the pronunciation of that river wrong. Istria. And that you're not that far from Odessa. So the fear would be if Russian troops were able to move along the Black Sea coast and take Odessa, Transnistria, with its Russian population, a small Russian population nevertheless, would be next within its sights. How does Transnistria operate? What's the system there?
If I can just answer that initial one on, and then I will come to the domestic. I mean, one of the fears, obviously, was that, and it seems quite well established, that one of the Russian war aims was to carve out a land bridge to Transnistria, and that because the Ukrainian army pushed the Russians back in the south, that immediate threat has been pushed away. But I think that opens up for Transnistria and for Moldova more generally a sort of more interesting kind of second order consequence, which is that especially Transnistria is now stuck in the ether without a conclusion. It's kind of stuck waiting for something to happen. And ultimately what that does for the conflict with Moldova and between Moldova and Transnistria is it makes it no longer predictable. It's no longer easy to figure out what's going to happen, because the war in Ukraine is, of course, unresolved. To the dynamics in Tiraspol, to the extent that outsiders can really understand what's going on there, because Transnistria is, I think, one of the more opaque of the kind of unrecognized states in terms of kind of what's going on. I mean, the analytical perspective, which is made by many analysts and also by myself, is that basically in Tiraspol there are two factions. There's an economic faction which is which is dominated overwhelmingly by Viktor Kushan, who is an oligarch who runs a business conglomerate called Sheriff. Many people, especially those of a footballing mind, may have heard of Sheriff Tiraspol, who occasionally competes in European competitions, which is owned
Champions League. Yeah,
exactly. He is in reality the power behind the throne in Transnistria, and my opinion is that basically everything that happens in Transnistria goes through him. There is another faction centered around Ignatiev, the foreign minister, which is more of a kind of security Russian loyalist faction. I think most people would describe it. I mean, I think that their influence can be overplayed in some of the analysis of Transnistria, but basically that's how the factions break down, and kind of how it works is that it kind of works almost as a kind of the analytical problem with Transnistria, and I think you guys, I'm sure that when you go on your tours, you discuss this, is that basically in any other state, normally what you would do is you would kind of disaggregate the politics and the economics of it. And in Transnistria, it's simply not possible, because the politics and the economics of it are the same, because Sheriff and this oligarch, Viktor Kushan, run everything. And the political interests of the state have melded with his own economic interests. And since 2014, when obviously the first round annexation of Crimea and the first invasion of Ukraine happened, and Moldova started to pursue a much closer relationship with the EU, his interests have increasingly diverged from those of Russia. So what that does is that's put Transnistria in this kind of unusual place where, and it's even senior figures in Chisinau have said this to me, that they believe that his view is, we don't want a Russian victory, which is counter to what most people, when they look at Transnistria on the map, think, because they see Russian soldiers and they see, even walking around the street, many more Russian flags than you see Transnistrian flags in some cases. And you go, of course, well, they just want to be annexed into Russia, also because that's what they say. But in reality, the reality is more complex. It's really about kind of people's wallets, or his wallets, and his bottom line.
It's absolutely fascinating place to be. You've got that sort of imagery. You've got Lenin everywhere. You've got the sort of big institutions of government that look very much like they did in Soviet times. But there again, you have as you talk about the economic side, there's steel works in the north. There's cement factories, and there are things like alcohol factory, even a caviar factory, and all of these work on cheap Russian gas.
Yes.
And that's the critical thing. And the other thing is they don't go to Russia, these products. They're all exported into the West. Poland, for example, is the biggest importer of oil from Transnistria. So Gushan's got a real problem on his hands, hasn't he? I mean, he needs these markets, but at the same time, that gas could be about to run out.
Yeah, and this is the great unknown. And Transnistria's economic model basically relies on gas that is provided free of charge by Russia through Gazprom, which is then sold domestically at kind of discounted rates to factories and homes and things of that sort. And that basically provides most of the kind of public funding for the state in Transnistria. But it also keeps industries like the steel plant in Ribnica and others kind of competitive internationally, and it helps them actually compete on the European market, where in any reality, kind of a small state's heavy industry should not. The open question here is that gas comes is transited through Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine is in between Transnistria and Russia. And the Ukrainians have said that the transit agreement that they have with Gazprom will lapse in, I think, at 6 a.m. on the 1st of January 2025. What happens then is a big unknown. It seems, at least in Chisinau, that there's a lack of, there's fear, but a lack of planning and understanding of what they're going to do. I mean, basically, if Transnistria was fully cut off from Russian gas and had to kind of buy at market rates, the worst case scenario is that you'd have an immediate humanitarian crisis and economic collapse, which then would open up many unwanted political questions for the Moldovans about would they need to sort of extend an economic arm and start funding things themselves? Would they need to come up with an urgent sort of political project for how to reintegrate Transnistria? And also sort of what would be the future of the Transnistrian government if it can no longer provide basic economic services to its citizens? There are other options, and my opinion, perhaps optimistically, is that because it would be so disastrous to the Moldovans also, and so destabilizing, that actually that won't come to pass, that probably some arrangement could be found. For example, I mean, you know, it's always difficult when talking about Moldova because some things in Moldova work very well and some things don't. But ultimately, and one would hope that perhaps the Moldovans, with some deft diplomacy, can ask the Ukrainians, look, could we pay the fees for the gas to be transited? We will kind of ensure X and Y to make sure that nothing bad happens. Otherwise, I mean, the gas could be routed kind of circuitously through a kind of Balkan route, which the Moldovans have said, look, if that happens, we will then pass on the gas to the Transnistrians. Obviously, that then opens up more second-order questions, such as would the Transnistrians be forced to pay transit fees to Chisinau? Unknown. Would they be able to pay the transit fees? That's also unknown. And
also the Transnistrians have had a power station which uses gas, which provides electricity to Moldova. So there's another critical link. We were the energy minister as he was working out the debt deal with Russia. Russia said that Moldova owed over $700 million for in unpaid gas fees, but the energy minister turned around and said, well, you haven't paid any of your transiting fees, and the amount we owe you is something like $8 or $12 million. So the suggestion also for him was that they would be able to source gas from that Balkan route, as you said, and that would get rid of their Russian dependency. So it's all in flux. It's all in flux at the moment. It's absolutely fascinating. Unless you want to say more about Moldova, I want to jump around, and I want to quote someone I think it's in Norway, from an article you wrote about the Arctic. So we're going to go well away from the Black Sea and the Balkans, and we're going to shoot up into the Arctic. You've got developments there that I want you to talk about as well. It's just an illustration of how far-reaching this conflict is going, and in terms of relations, with Russia being affected. So this is somebody who deals with the Arctic, and I'm afraid I haven't got his name here, but remember it: no issue, no region, no matter of cooperation is unaffected by Ukraine, he says. And what the full implications for the Arctic, we are yet to know the full extent. So what is happening in the Arctic, Jacob?
So I believe that was actually Norway's prime minister saying that. So an impeccable force. Look, I mean, the Arctic the Arctic is an unusual theatre here because Russia's interests haven't actually changed very much. Russia is still interested in a stable Arctic. It's been telegraphing that, I think, quite clearly. I mean, when you look, when you talk to Norwegian officials, I mean, the amount of sort of incidents that you would describe as destabilizing actually dropped quite quickly after the invasion of Ukraine. In some reasons because units were being redeployed and things of that sort, but also because the Russians didn't want to risk anything going on, I think. Well, I think that's, but I think that's kind of the easiest way to put it. Basically, the Arctic is in flux. A lot of the international agreements and international fora that have existed and have made the Arctic actually into a quite successful area of cooperation between Russia and the West are really under threat now. Immediately after the war in Ukraine, the so-called Arctic Seven, which are the other Arctic states, excluding Russia, said, look, we can't work with you. We're going to freeze cooperation with the Arctic Council, within various other kind of little fora that make sure that the Arctic...
Just to give people an idea, I mean, what did the Arctic Council do? What did they, why did they need to cooperate? What were the kind of stuff that they were working on?
The most important thing that the Arctic Council did, from my vantage point, was actually a lot of scientific cooperation. It was funding things, making sure that scientists were working together, designing projects, things on microplastics in the Arctic, animals, things of that sort. But they also helped providing actually a forum where people could talk to each other. I mean, it was actually unusual, I think, especially after 2014, for Russian foreign minister, the US Secretary of State, to actually get together and to actually have a forum, which was a little bit further away from where most journalists were. I mean, they mostly met in Tromsø in the north, and many Washington correspondents were not going there, right? Where they could have a talk a little bit away from the cameras, actually, about kind of what do we want, what are our interests, kind of, and how are we going to kind of make sure the Arctic, as it's changing now with climate change, remains stable. All of that is under threat, basically. And in some sense, and the Russian criticism here is that we didn't want the Arctic Council to be frozen. We didn't want all of this stuff to suddenly be put on pause. We were very willing to be constructive partners. And actually, I think when you look at the Arctic, I think it also provides an interesting way of disaggregating actually the Western interests here. I mean, talking exclusively from a political angle, not necessarily a military one. I mean, the hawks in the Arctic are Canada and Denmark. They're not the US, and it's not sort of Norway. And actually the kind of US, when it comes to Arctic policy, is sort of a middling power. They're kind of interested in keeping things ticking along with the Russians. And actually one of the predictions that was made to me was that if this freeze with Russia goes on into a new, for want of a better word, a kind of new ice curtain or a new Cold War in the next few decades, that actually the Arctic might be an area where you could see little signs of warming with Russia, simply for the fact that it's far away and people don't really care what's going on there. I mean, one place which I've been thinking about recently is the Bering Straits, and American cooperation, coast guards and things like that will actually continue quite well there with the Russians. They're often picking up the phone saying, our boat, a fishing boat has gone astray, please can you go collect it? So some of that communication remains, even though in other theatres it doesn't.
Right. Okay. And I'm just interested, when you see hawks with Denmark and Canada, what does that mean in terms of Arctic policy? What does it mean, hawkish being? What does that mean?
I mean, I think with the Canadians are quite kind of the Canadians, they basically wanted everything frozen. They wanted the Russians kicked out. Basically, I think that's how it would boil down to. I mean, the Canadian Arctic policy is interesting because obviously it's more of a domestic thing. They're quite far away from Russia, and that being hawkish on the Arctic is sort of low cost, low risk for a domestic politician. For Denmark, I think, and this is my me kind of doing a kind of spot analysis of Danish foreign policy, but I think that because of Greenland and sort of the unique political relationship there, I think Denmark being hawkish on the Arctic is a way of signaling to Greenland and people in Greenland that it has an interest in them. Obviously, because Denmark's defense presence in Greenland is pretty minimal, and having outsourced most of it to the US, actually.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to hop to thousands of miles away, and we're going to go to the Pacific now. You write about tech quite often. And you were following a story up, I think was it to do with Palau, or no? It was to do with the TK. I've forgotten the name of the country now. It's so tiny. Say it again.
Tokelau,
yeah. So there was you were doing a story on the abuse of the domain name, and that led to a story that broke last summer that I think everybody possibly watching here probably knows about. But tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I think the best place probably is to take this chronologically. So I was doing it's actually probably to ask a question, actually, which is that the biggest domain. So the way the internet works is divided up into little domains. These are the things that everyone knows about. .uk, for example, is one. .fr is another, and all countries and political entities have one. The biggest one for over a decade was .tk, which is one that I think everyone has seen, but no one has actually thought about what it is, and often it's buried in the spam of your internet of your email folder. But basically, Tokelau is 3 islands in the Pacific of 1,400 people, and sort of in the early 2000s, they made a deal with a Dutch entrepreneur to basically give him the right in perpetuity to kind of sell websites on .tk, and I thought this was interesting. I mean, it basically became kind of the sewer of the internet, so to speak. I mean, it became the domain of choice for cyber criminals because this Dutch entrepreneur was giving them out for free. And as everyone knows, anything that is given out for free on the internet is going to be abused by criminals, as it was. I mean, here, most of it was email spam and sort of kind of low effort things, but there were also kind of researchers spotted sort of jihadists using kind of .tk websites for kind of mirrors of their sites, and kind of Chinese.
So Tokelau was understandably across with him, and this guy is called Zerbier, and he's based in Amsterdam.
Yeah,
and you,
yeah.
you and see him to say, look, oi, what's this all about? And then off the bat, he told you about another story.
Yes, exactly. So the Tokelauans were frustrated, but far away in the Pacific, and I tried to get in touch with them. Go, look, kind of, could you just answer a few questions about this? Just I'm doing this story, and he went, and I think this gives an insight into his character. Yes, I will happily talk to you, which he never did. But I have got a great other story. I also run the domains for a number of African countries, one of which is Mali, .ml. And for the past 10 years, I've noticed hundreds of thousands of millions of emails, basically, which are supposed to go to the US military, which uses .mil. And because of a typo, they've come to me. And I've tried to warn the Americans for some time, and they basically showed no interest. And now the contract is coming up, and I'm getting a bit worried that it's going to go back to the Malians, who of course have a close relationship with Russia and Wagner, and with their new military, with their military regime. And I wouldn't want this to get into the wrong hands. And he went, I can give you 100,000 US military emails just to show you as evidence that it's true. So he gives me 100,000 US military emails, most of which are not very interesting, most of which are soldiers signing up for McDonald's discounts and making a typo. But in them are things that would be concerning to the US. For example, there was a forthcoming trip for the head of the US Army to Indonesia with his hotel number. There was things from the FBI on communication with the Turkish embassy, and then just a really endless amount of kind of medical and personal data about US soldiers, which for one US soldier is not really a concern. But when you suddenly have a kind of endless stream coming in with really no way to stop it, because people will always make typos, then that becomes a concern. So yeah, an unusual one, but I think one that shows kind of maybe make sure you're not making typos when trying to send something to a US soldier.
So, and has that been changed or dealt with in some way or another? And also, did anyone get in contact with you after you've been given the emails?
So I'll take this in two parts. So basically, one of the things that is difficult is that a lot of this was from contractors or from US soldiers sending it from their own personal Gmail accounts or things of that sort to their military accounts. And for the perspective of the Department of Defense, I mean, the Department of Defense cannot set something up on your Gmail account saying, be careful, you're making a typo. So ultimately, this is an unfixable problem that has been created from during the early days of the internet, when the US went, oh, well, we'll take .mil. That seems good, without thinking that there was also a country called Mali who would have something very close. I know that for internal emails, if you make a typo, it does send you a warning. Did you mean to send this to .ml? So the internal leak of information hopefully has been stopped. But the US military works with hundreds of thousands of contractors who may not be as good with their typos. As for, did anyone get in touch with me? No, is the answer. The people who got in touch with me were senators, actually, senators and
Right.
people in Congress who went, "Oh, we're really concerned about this. Can you put us in touch with everyone who we need to talk to?" Basically, I think kind of making sure that kind of committee appointments and things like that were their information for their committee appointments was up to scratch. So then the next time someone from the Department of Defense came in to testify, they could ask some difficult questions to them.
If anyone's got any questions for Jacob, please put them down in the Q&A box, and then you can put them directly to him. And we've got a great list of people watching, one or two fellow journalists as well. So I expect lots of questions. I hope for lots of questions. Belarus, the ball's on the other foot here. You've written a bit about there. And instead of, we often think of the Russian espionage, using internet. We can go back to Trump grabbing the emails, but the Belarusian opposition are trying to do something similar themselves against Lukashenko. Tell us a bit about that, and is it effective?
Yes. So, well, there is a. I think the best place to start is there is a radical side to the Belarusian opposition, which has now, since the war in Ukraine, has basically moved to Kiev, and one of the kind of parts of that is a group called the Cyber Partisans, and they're kind of the way they describe themselves is sort of as the sort of cyber warfare arm of the Belarusian resistance, and their operations are mainly be focused on trying to hack Russian and Belarusian kind of state institutions and to kind of reveal embarrassing information about them and kind of things of that sort. I think initially they were more effective than they are now. I think with the war and Ukrainian cyber hackers, cyber defenses in Russia and in Belarus have gone up, and that's made life for them more difficult. Even though I know recently, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, they did get a cache out of the Belarusian KGB, one that did not rename itself, of people wanting to inform and kind of people kind of writing to them and things of that sort. Are they effective? I think with Belarus and the Belarusian opposition, the answer is unfortunately no, and increasingly they're less effective. Actually, it's a classic case of exiles basically becoming kind of disconnected, I think, from political realities. And kind of fighting among themselves. I mean, everyone knows from the Belarusian opposition, there's Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the kind of poster of the Belarusian kind of democratic kind of exile movement, and ultimately the cyber partisans and their allies, the Kalinowski regiments, who are kind of fighting on the front in Ukraine, have actually just been, most of their targets have actually been her, really, saying that she's not radical enough, she's not supporting Ukraine enough, things of that sort. And so ultimately, I think they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot, so to speak, and making it more difficult for kind of European partners who would like to engage with them to ensure that they're engaging with the right people. One organization that is very effective when it comes to dealing with the conflict, and particularly in Russia in particular, is Bellingcat. And there's also another website called Insider. And sometimes I think you do articles for them. I'm just to see how I'm interested. Russia's become far more effective at clamping down on the opposition. Are they able to still produce stories that expose the regime? They've had an incredible record. For example, the Salisbury attacks, tracing the passports and identities and exposing the identities of the GRU officers who were involved in that attack. What's your estimate of how they're doing at the moment? So actually, in some sense, this San Marino piece actually started its intellectual journey as a Bellingcat piece before eventually kind of moving over. So I can't speak for Insider, but I can speak for, I can offer an opinion on Bellingcat. And ultimately, I think, yes, they are still being effective. I think the pressure on them has gone up, personal pressure, kind of things of that sort. But basically, kind of Russia is an unusual one in that there are just huge data markets. So if you are Bellingcat and you're looking for someone specific, it's actually relatively easy, if you know what you're doing, to kind of buy someone's phone records with all the location data, buy their, have they ever been to court, their number plate, the history of their number plates, things of that sort, which I think is particular to Russia and kind of Ukraine and Belarus and other kind of similar states, which makes it slightly easier, I think, when doing kind of investigative journalism there compared to, say, the US, where there aren't disgruntled employees who will suddenly upload their entire, for example, T-Mobile's entire database to the internet for a fee, which does happen in Russia and which makes some of their journalism a bit easier.
Wow, that's amazing. We're talking with Jake Judah about Russia's, well, the war with Russia and the other fronts, the outside conflict itself, and some of the stories that he's covering in numerous places and unexpected places. One recent story, which is not directly about, but I think has offered a valuable view, was you looked at the Afghan embassies and the diplomatic staff left over after the takeover of the Taliban. A fascinating and quite tragic story of diplomats who remained in those residences and in those embassies because these haven't recognized the Taliban. There was a lesson that they drew from the conflict in Afghanistan and support from the United States, a warning perhaps for Ukraine. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, these are tragic figures, sort of representatives who've been appointed by the former Afghan government and had basically been abandoned after the fall of Kabul. And speaking to many of them, very angry often, and some of them actually kind of drifting off into kind of almost conspiratorial territory. What their warning for Ukraine was be careful, you can be abandoned and you have to prepare for being abandoned. I think the Afghan case obviously is different from the Ukrainian case, but I think.
But a real sense of being let down by an ally. I mean, I guess on the one hand, there's
exactly, yes, it was really a case of betrayal.
The Afghan government. Yeah, exactly.
They really felt, and still, when I did it, an intense sense of betrayal. But also, I think is particular to Afghanistan, but may also have that taking place with Ukraine have appeared there, kind of almost a kind of naive hope that that the West would show interest in them again. And you see that with the Afghan opposition. I mean, there is one of the military groups that are fighting the Taliban now, led by Ahmed Massoud. I mean, figures associated with him, I think, really believe that the West will show interest and will show interest in his group and will start providing funds and weapons eventually, which is just something which is not real. It's not realistic. But I think being psychologically prepared for what comes after in the event of defeats, I think, is the lesson that needs to be drawn from Afghanistan and from those figures, that there was no plan for what to do if they were defeated.
I hope that my dog stays quiet for the remaining 10 or so minutes of the webinar. He's just something outside. I'm keen to know what else you're covering, Jacob, and there's development in the news that I'm keen to talk about, and you may or may not have heard about, and that's really the shift in Russia's war footing, and the Shoigu, who's the Minister of Defense, being replaced by Belousov. And Belousov is really a technocrat, somebody who's very much respected for his knowledge of financial institutions and organizational. In a way, it really made me think of Hitler appointing Albert Baer as in charge of the munitions factories and war effort in the later stages of the war. And maybe that's a crass comparison, I don't know. But do you have any thought about that? And I'm also keen to know what else you're thinking of covering, what other things you're covering.
I mean, what I've been covering recently which I think is of interest to you guys, is Cyprus, actually. I mean, I do have some thoughts on that, but I think there are more experts on the Russian military and the Russian Ministry of Defense who could offer a more incisive analysis.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I'll let you off on.
Although I will say, I mean, appointing an economist, I saw some people kind of joking about it online, but ultimately production and efficiencies is really important in warfare, and actually it doesn't seem like such a stupid move, especially when the military side of it is being done by the high command. But on Cyprus is something else that I worked on. I mean, recently I've written a chapter for a forthcoming book by the Institute of Strategic Studies, which is a think tank here in London, on Cypriot foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean, unfortunately delayed by the war in Gaza, which I'm sure everyone can understand that writing about foreign policy in the region at the moment is trickier, especially for a book. But Cyprus is another state which has really been kind of impacted by the war in Ukraine. And kind of, I think the lasting thing there is that Cyprus, which has historically been criticised for having a sort of ambiguous policy between Russia and the West, really has been forced to choose, and now has fully bandwagoned with the United States, basically.
And what kind of things? And I'm just back from Cyprus, and we had a fascinating time. One of the things we were looking at was the British sovereign bases, which have been there since Cyprus was given independence and before, of course. And Russian operations, spy ships being brought in into Limassol, very close to the bases. GRU being involved to try and recruit. People on the bases, just also fascinating stuff. And the Republic of Cyprus really, turning a blind eye or not really worrying about it at all. But that's changed. Cyprus has now made a significant shift. Why is that, Jacob?
I mean, ultimately, I think it's two. There are two reasons here. One is that Cyprus has come under increasing pressure. The second is that, seen from Nicosia, the Cypriot leadership basically has wanted greater US presence in Cyprus, kind of as a tripwire in the Eastern Mediterranean, to try and anchor Cyprus within a kind of US security umbrella, even though it's impossible because of the Cyprus question for Cyprus to join NATO. But what they've tried to do is to kind of really knit itself into it in the Eastern Mediterranean. So in terms of actually practical steps, I mean, sort of in March last year, Cyprus signed a partnership agreement with the New Jersey National Guard. Sounds not particularly sexy, but from a Cypriot perspective, it is, because what it helps, it involves kind of cooperation and training, something which the Cypriots had historically been excluded from because of the Cyprus question, and also because of their ties to Russia. The US has also ended its embargo on the Republic of Cyprus, which is a kind of real big win for the Cypriots.
What was that? I've got to grab my plug as I do this, but what was that embargo? Just remind us.
So the US had imposed a kind of a long-standing embargo in 1987 on arms exports to Cyprus. Obviously, part of that was to do with keeping Turkey on side, Turkey, a NATO ally, much more important than Cyprus, as seen from Washington. But basically, the ending of the embargo was kind of understood, I think, among kind of foreign policy officials in Nicosia as a sort of a reward for various measures to tighten up sort of financial laxities in Cyprus, which had helped Russian oligarchs and figures in Russia kind of launder funds. It also, and you mentioned sort of Russian vessels around Cyprus. I mean, it also followed the scrapping of an agreement with Russia that allowed the Russians to make port calls on Cyprus, which was a concern to the Americans and also the British, actually.
It's absolutely fascinating because that represents a significant shift. I mean, partly it's the financial influence that the Russians had. Obviously, tourism's a thing, but financial services and being able to set up companies there fairly anonymously, the amount of money Cyprus and also from the Balkans, and this dates way back to the 1990s and the wars in Yugoslavia. Serbia had significant amounts of money going through Cyprus during that time period. So this has been an evolution, a move away from that. Interestingly enough, on our recent trip in the north, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, as themselves, the TRNC, still has a significant amount of Russians living there, staying there, doing business there. Also, a number of Israeli companies doing significant developments. For Israeli, I think you might mention it's a bit difficult to decipher whether it's one or the other. We haven't got any more questions here, so we're going to have to wrap up fairly soon. You're hoping, I don't want to say too much away, but you're going to do something on the US-Russian cooperation, if possible. Are you hoping to try and head north?
Yes, hopefully, and this is a real fingers crossed. I'm getting a grant to go to the islands 3 kilometers apart in the Bering Strait, where a village of US Inuits quite literally live under the eyes of Russian soldiers as the only Americans that do so. So hopefully there will be some work.
Say that again, just for sentence scale, I haven't got my head around it.
In the Bering Strait, there are 2 islands. So Russia and Alaska kind of come together, and in the middle of the strait, there are 2 islands, Little Diomede and Big Diomede. And Big Diomede is Russian, and Little Diomede is American. There's an American village on Little Diomede. 3 kilometers across the ice, there are 2 small Russian border guard bases who patrol the border. And since the Cold War, this Inuit village has basically been appointed as the sentinels of the border by the US. And so they sit there with their binoculars, making sure that nothing untoward happens and no one crosses over.
And so that they can't cross back and forth as movement. I mean, presumably there would be fishing communities, and they would have previously.
They're not allowed. No, I mean, the fascinating thing about it actually is that there used to be 4 Inuit villages on Big Diomede that were deported in 1949, 1950 by Stalin when the borders came to the Arctic. And ever since, this island has basically been cut off from sort of ethnic kin and kind of linguistic family members, really, actually, who were deported to the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union started to collapse, they went with dogs and sleds thousands of kilometers up the Soviet coast looking for people who'd been deported in 1950.
Wow. Oh, God. Well, I'm looking forward to that story. There, we're going to have to wrap it up. No questions. I'm disappointed. I'm looking at the long list of people to my right who are all capable of asking questions, but they're being shy this time around. Jacob, it's been a fascinating tour. We started in San Marino, we went to Transnistria, we went up to the Arctic, we've done Belarusia, we've done Cyprus, and even the Pacific. It's been a great tour, and as you say, the many aspects of this war are very, very far-reaching. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Do stay with